fog's thick as curdled milk.
Never took you for a poet.
Oh, but I am one. Want to hear a limerick?
Sure.
Lambert, what a prig.
Not bad.
Yes, poetry was never Geralt's forte. Better leave this matter to Priscilla or Dandelion at the very least. However, the White Wolf was always good at playing Gwent, helping out his friends, seducing sorceresses, and killing monsters, of course. But you gotta discuss the reward first. As you may have guessed, today we're going to take a look into the Witcher franchise. Recall how it all started, how a small Polish company has set a new quality standard for AAA projects, what was Andrzej Sapkowski's greatest mistake, and why did The Witcher become so popular. Get your potions ready and your swords sharpened, as today we will dive into the world of The Witcher. You're on Drigmatic, so let's get to it. Truth be told, one should start their acquaintance with The Witcher by reading the homonymous book series written by a Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski. There are 8 books if we count Season of Storms, that came out in 2013, but it doesn't expand the story of the White Wolf. It only tells us about a small period in his life between the major events. The other 7 books tell the story chronologically and introduce the reader to Geralt's nearest and dearest, to his lifestyle, and to the local colors in general. As a person who read all the books in the series in one sitting, I strongly recommend that you do the same, because that will make your experience with the games light years better. But even if we take the games out of the picture, each book will surely provide you with great pleasure. As soon as you're done with the books, chronologically it will be the time to get to the games. And here, the first game that was released in 2007 comes into spotlight. The first Witcher had a rough start. At first, the game's development was entrusted to the Metropolis studio, that has gotten the green light from Sapkowski himself. Despite the fact that great stakes were placed on the plot and tough moral dilemmas, the game process turned out to be centered around action rather than around roleplay. One way or another, serious doubts in the game's commercial success and unseasoned technical problems led to a development freeze. That is until the rights for the franchise found a new proprietor in the face of a small, unknown company, CD Projekt Red, who were die-hard fans of Sapkowski's books. And there is a bit of story to that, by the way. The guys from CD Projekt offered Andrzej a revenue share from the upcoming game, or a one-off payment of 35,000 zloty. Skeptical about video games and even more skeptical about the game's success, the writer sold the rights to the Witcher universe for approximately $10,000. He'll greatly regret this decision, but we'll get to that. Initially, the game was about to have its own engine, but soon it became evident that it would be much easier to just use an already existing one. So CD Projekt made an agreement with BioWare to use their Aurora engine, although it had to be heavily modified. And thus, the development of The Witcher officially began. Its release was postponed 3 times, by the way. Yes, CD Projekt was delaying the release dates of their games even before it became cyberpunk. Before we continue, it's necessary to make a disclaimer. There will be spoilers both for the books and for the games further in the video. So, you've been warned. Let's get back to the books for a moment. Why everyone loved the Witcher saga? This book series by Mr. Sapkowski is an example of so-called postmodern fantasy. It has the surroundings of the late Middle Ages, fantastic beasts of various races, sorceresses, and where there are sorceresses, there is magic. And, of course, people who are desperately trying to survive in this crap and not to lose their marbles. But despite all of the above, the characters of postmodern fantasy behave differently from their timeline. Their mindsets, day-to-day problems, political and love affairs, their speech, often with lots of colorful swear words, their grim humor accompanied by a very mundane and down-to-earth narrative that is full of pop culture references, seem to fit in perfectly in today's life. Any characters in this story, even sidekicks, are extremely well written. Their development is brilliant. It makes you love, hate, sympathize and cheer for them. Sapkowski's books abound with Chekhov's guns. Character motivation is clear, fitting humor and satire brighten up the routine, while the morally grey story throws at you some uneasy questions. The devs of the first Witcher were faced with quite a task. First, they made a gutsy and risky decision to go on with Geralt's story, instead of just making a video game adaptation of the books. Here I ought to make a friendly reminder that Geralt was impaled with a hayfork at the end of the last book. And secondly, Andrzej didn't assist CD Projekt with the plot in any way, so the studio had to do with its own script writers. This fact entails the third point. Mr. Sapkowski has set a high standard in his books, and so the game's story had to be up to par. Obviously, maintaining the same level of storytelling without the author was rather problematic. Anyway, The Witcher saw the light of day in autumn 2007. It was a rocky start. The game had lots of bugs, from creepy broken textures to the scripts that refused to work. Many were also unsatisfied with the combat system and deemed it clunky and tough to get used to. Mainly because it was quite slowish, and that was scaring off some players. The player had to stay sharp and click at the right time, but a very feeble sense of a sword and randomly changing pace of battle could easily spoil your immersion of the combat system. Moreover, the Witcher had 3 combat styles in his disposal that he could combine while in combat. Different enemies required different approaches. Strong style against slow NPCs with a huge amount of health, fast style against agile enemies, and group style against a pack of wolves. In addition to that, you could adjust the camera angle by selecting a classic over-the-shoulder view, as well as the high or low isometric view. At first, all these cobwebs seemed terrifying, but in fact you could easily master them after 2-3 hours of playing. As for the combat animations, even now to me they look quite decent, let alone 2007. Unlike in the third game, here it was vital to use potions, oils and other buffs to avoid a one-way ticket to the Malus Island. The game felt much more challenging than its successors. If in Witcher 2 and 3 there were a couple of tough beasts that actually posed a threat to Geralt, then in the first game even a lone Barghest could take you out. As said, each enemy required a different combat style, so when you changed your stance, you had to quickly adjust to new timings, which was really hard. Also, from my personal point of view, there were some imbalanced areas that you had to get through in order to progress the storyline. For example, it was rather unpleasant to encounter a number of enemies of different types in a cave. It was impossible to sneak past them without a fight, which often resulted in the player getting surrounded, cornered, and killed. It was even ridiculous at times when numerous enemies surrounded Geralt from all sides, and the player simply couldn't move under the barrage of hits. What has also upset me is that even in Enhanced Edition, played by yours truly, where all bugs are claimed to have been fixed, there still were broken scripts, corrupted saves, and game crashes. I'll admit, because of all of this, I've almost dropped the first Witcher several times, but the game's positive side was always brighter than its negative side. First, we play as Christopher Lambert from 1995 Mortal Kombat. Okay, enough goofing around. The gameplay was great. The combat system, also it required some time to get used to, was totally worth the effort. Yet some people were so traumatized by the combat system that they uninstalled the game never to play it again. And they cannot be blamed. For a 2007 game, such combat system was rather idiosyncratic. The characters came off brilliant though. Both main story and side quests were captivating. The main story itself wasn't reaching for the stars, but as the studio's first attempt to continue with Geralt's story on their own, quite impressive. The amount of book references is enormous, which is great. The idea of an amnesiac protagonist may seem hackneyed today, but it was a universal and justified solution for CD Projekt. The game's soundtrack and graphics were certainly up to par as well. The only bad apple in the bowl was the game's optimization right after the release. Even now, many years later, if you decide to launch the first Witcher for old time's sake, be ready for crashes, corrupted saves, and broken scripts. However, even taking this into account, the immeasurable success of the first Witcher isn't surprising. The game received uncountable positive reviews from both critics and users, won lots of awards and has sold 2 million copies. The fact that CDPR made their first project a PC exclusive only adds to their credit. They took a gamble and won the jackpot. 4 years later, in 2011, the next game, Witcher 2 Assassins of the Kings, is released. From the get-go, you see that you no longer play as Chris Lambert. Yes, he still resembles an experienced alcoholic on the booze, but his face is much more close to the one we're used to. And I'm not talking about Henry Cavill, God forbid. As for the more profound changes, it's certainly the new Red Engine, which was obviously created by CD Projekt themselves, and it changed everything. First, the gameplay underwent a major overhaul. Its core remained the same, however. Geralt was still using potions, signs and swords. Yet, they took it to a whole new level. Now you didn't have to switch your combat stance depending on the fight. There was only one stance in the game. The combat system now made intuitive sense, and had become more graceful and impressive thanks to the new animations and revamped signs, which together made the gameplay much more pleasant than in the first game. Although, nonetheless, that PC still remained the Witcher's target platform, the devs made some steps towards consoles. Let's take the game's visual interface, for instance, that became much more gamepad-friendly. Then graphics. It took a huge leap forward, so if you decide to put all the sliders to Ultra, your computer will do an equally huge kaboom. Everything in the second Witcher looks decent even from today's perspective. Character models, post effects, armor and weapon textures. The sequel can't boast of an open world, yet the locations became much more detailed despite looking pretty linear. You can actually see all the passion that the game designers put into their work and how they choose quality over quantity. Various in-game references like those to Fight Club or the infamous unsuccessful leap of faith from Assassin's Creed, the game's scenery and encounters in general, act as great examples of this passionate approach. I personally hardly noticed any recurring moments, yet there sure were plenty of memorable ones. Here we need to get out of jail almost completely defenseless. Half an hour later we're taking part in a fortress onslaught, and shortly afterwards we're searching for the troll's wife, so the damn lunk would stop drinking and finally fix the bridge. You know, as trolls do. This game has something for everyone. You can participate in a tournament, push your luck in dice, or try yourself in arm wrestling or fist fighting. Not to mention that you can always take a break with the damsel, or, if completely bored, you can always switch to arena and go berserk. And speaking of damsels, the game has almost the same amount of explicit scenes as Wild Hunt, and if in the first game the player only had romance cards, such a gift in the sequel cannot be overestimated, only not all were this lucky. By that I mean that in the pirate version of the game, the devs replaced damsels' models with an old hag, so when the good part commenced, you could only feel pity for the poor lad who pirated the game. As for the game's difficulty in general, there is a steady course towards simplification. Back in 2007, there was death around every corner waiting for Geralt, especially if it was me playing. But in 2011, the situation changed for the better. Naturally, an overhauled combat system, which was turned into something that we are all now accustomed to, was a major contributor here. Isometry went straight to the dumpster, and the classic third-person view was finally chosen as the only option for the series. Fights began to feel more dynamic, spectacular finishing animations appeared, diluting the routine monotonous bruising. The game constantly encouraged the active use of various signs, which, unlike in the first game, were now available all at once. They also did a good job with the bosses. I'll never forget Kairon, Drog, and the goddamn dragon. The first one is a giant beast with huge tentacles and a mouth full of sharp teeth that, above all that, spits poison that not only deals damage but paralyzes the player as well. And forget not that you absolutely cannot stand still while fighting this giant, or you'll get squished in a blink of an eye. That's why you have to constantly run, jump and roll, patiently waiting for a moment to use Eden and cut off the bastard's tentacles. The next adversary awaits us on the battlefield. Drog was once a commander, quite a tyrant in fact. Yet in death he turned into a horrifying monstrosity that consists not of blood and flesh, but of some scrap like shields, barrels, ropes and swords. After hearing that you may think, well, that doesn't sound that bad. But in reality this guy brings in some hit. Literally, he's all engulfed in flames and is constantly charging towards you. He can also summon a rain of flaming arrows or request a trebuchet volley. But the boss that cost me 2 hours and a chunk of my nervous system to defeat comes in the face of a dragon in the third chapter. It's a peculiar boss in terms of backstory. Legends say that a long time ago dragons ruled the continent and made the first colonizers cower. Then came the witches and exterminated almost all of the fire-breathing beasts, putting them on the verge of extinction. That's why Geralt, as a true Greenpeace member, tries not to kill but to protect the beasts who have found themselves in the red bestiary list. The more interesting it is to watch sorceresses, kinda noble in other fantasy, and unbearable brats in Sapkowski's universe, charming the last living dragon and making him attack the white wolf against its will. Thus, even when the bloodshed was over, there was no sweet sense of victory for me because I probably just slaughtered the last dragon of its kind. But do you know what all these bosses have in common? QTE. This tumor of the game industry hadn't been completely removed by 2011 and was getting on my nerves so much that I could hardly get a grasp of what was going on the screen. But if this tumor of a game feature was tolerable during boss fights, then random QTE moments that popped up throughout the rest of the game infuriated me so much that I wanted to punch through the screen. But then I recalled the cost of it, wiped it with a napkin and continued playing in silence. And that concludes it for the game's cons, I guess. Instead, there is one more huge advantage that made me buy the whole trilogy on Steam. You see, when you complete a Witcher game, your belongings get transferred to the next game in line. This happens when you finish the first game and start Assassins of Kings. Moreover, your decisions in the second game impact the course of events in the third one. Let's say you've killed Leto in Assassins of Kings. That means he won't appear in Wild Hunt, and you'll have to do without his questline. The list of such examples goes on. In conclusion, I'll put it that way. Witcher 2 is a great game that was undeservingly ignored by many. I played it for over 30 hours and enjoyed every minute of it. Actually, I'm planning on getting back to this game after this review for a second playthrough. Critics and millions of gamers shared my opinion, so the game sold more than 5 million copies. Certainly a great success. However, if Assassins of Kings was more of a local success, then Wild Hunt brought CD Projekt tons of money, as well as mind-spinning fame and recognition. The game development kicked off as soon as the scale of the sequel's impact became apparent. Its success allowed CD Projekt to seize the potential of the new chapter about the adventures of the White Wolf and to fully realize it. Now the task was to take the franchise to the global market, and to the Western audience in particular. Only these guys don't like complicated mechanics, unintuitive controlling and harsh challenges. At the time, the studio was perfectly aware that the beauty of Slavic folklore would be appreciated in Eastern Europe, where gamers like it rough. And so the devs decided to have it both ways, and this is how it all played out. One aspect remained completely unchanged. I'm talking about cluttered visual interface. Throughout the franchise, it received some minor improvements, but still remained overloaded. In the first game it was a disaster, in Assassins of Kings it was kinda bearable, and in Wild Hunt it remained more or less the same. As the time, or Cyberpunk to be exact, has shown, we can call it CD Projekt's bane, because even in Cyberpunk you have no desire to dig into your inventory. As for the combat system, it didn't undergo any profound changes, yet it feels much fresher than in the second game. First, fights have become more dynamic thanks to the new animations, perks and moves. Now all of Geralt's fights look like a death dance, just like in Mr. Sapkowski's books, especially if you get yourself the Whirlwind perk. Then the White Wolf fencing will delight your eye and cut enemies to pieces at the same time. Literally. You are allowed to dismember enemies in combat, which brings quite a lot of satisfaction. In the second game, Geralt wasn't as agile, and when facing multiple enemies had to deal with them one by one. Blocking hits was quite a task, let alone parrying. In the third game, things have significantly improved. The Witcher doesn't feel so stiff anymore, we can easily dodge attacks and parry. This helps not only in duels but in local brawls as well. The whole game process became non-linear. They're perfectly suited in open world. For example, you've taken a side quest where you need to find an item. But somehow you've already acquired this item while doing some other quest. So the quest will be completed instantaneously, and Geralt will get his reward. Due to the open world, the number of quests and activities in the game is mind-boggling. Moreover, the quality of these quests remained on a superior level. Just take a Greedy God quest where peasants bring offerings to some all-god, who turns out to be a common sentient fatty. As for the game's difficulty, again we see the tendency towards simplification. Even when playing on Death March, there won't be any particular challenges in your playthrough, except a total imbalance in the economical aspect of the game. I was troubled the most by a werewolf in one of the early locations, only because of my low level and weak armor. Apart from that, all other enemies are no match for Geralt. That is, if you're not a masochist who decides to switch on the automatic leveling. Then any wolfpack, I'm not kidding, any stray dog would one-shot you into oblivion. The game's low difficulty is being felt acutely during fights with the Wild Hunt itself. After reading the books, we expect a truly legendary battle, yet we get a rumble with some pompous punks in fancy armor. Still, it's a spectacular rumble, don't get me wrong. I also have to mention the game's impeccable story DLCs. CD Projekt Red sure showed the whole video game industry how to make DLCs. Hearts of Stone, despite being rather short, was extremely eventful. This DLC unveiled the true identity of Gunther Odim, who Geralt encounters at the very beginning of the main game. It told us the tragic story of Olgrid I Everic and what price he had to pay for his immortality. Despite a rather grim and sorrowful background, this is a Witcher game, so there is still lots of stuff that will make you laugh. Just let Vladimir von Everic possess the White Wolf's body, sit back and observe. As for the story of Blood and Wine, many claim that it was better than the main game's plot, and I see their point. Just take a look at Toussaint. The untroubled, picture-perfect land of fair maidens, noble knights, vampires, blood and wine. And to cut the long story short, you need to see it, you need to play it. Personal experience is worth 1,000 words, and so on and so forth. Narrative also took a huge leap forward. Although the plot of the first game was good, you could see how the inexperienced scriptwriters were trying to bring a dead character back to life, while providing an explanation to that. And to my mind, they succeeded. The story turned out to be believable. In the sequel, the drastic improvement in the narrative structure, quality and presentation is visible with the naked eye. For some, this may sound too pretentious, but if this wasn't a Sapkowski-level narrative, then very close to it. As for the third game, that's a total kick-ass, pardon me. The third game tells the story so smoothly that even folks who are not familiar with the Middle Ages setting, fantasy or video games in general, admit that the plot is indeed very captivating. And to be honest, this even raises certain questions. Who the hell is the scriptwriter?
What the hell? Black magic! He's a fucking witch! Get him!
And no, it's not that haha he swears, it's that the dialogues of some sidekick NPCs are written with passion. That makes them feel so lively, and you subconsciously wanna go and help the grandma find her frying pan, or the statue's lost balls, or go and hurt the pigs. The plot in Wild Hunt is written in keeping with the best traditions of Andrzej Sapkowski. Here the boundary between good and evil is blurred, so even if you are sure that you've done a good deed and are now expecting some kind of reward or at least appraisal from local NPCs, be not surprised when they turn their backs on you. Such is the lot of a mutant. The non-linear plot structure allows you to create a story of your own, and to make unique choices and face the consequences, no matter how terrible they may be. And most of the time it's impossible to foresee these consequences. I still remember how shocked I was during my first playthrough when Bloody Baron decided to make a swing for it. After I freed the Whispering Hillock to save the children, I tried my best, you know the rest. All this left a sour aftertaste, taking into account that I thoroughly completed every quest related to Bloody Baron's family not to ruin anything, and then a blow came from the blind spot. But that's what makes Wild Hunt so great. Any player can experience a unique, separate story, can see something very dear in the characters. And that's why Geralt's epilogue line sounds so nostalgic and sad. Ah, too sad. Witcher 3 Wild Hunt not only brought global popularity to the franchise and sold nearly 30 million copies, it has also, according to millions of reviews by both critics and users, set a new standard for the action RPG genre. The success of the third game was so mind-spinning that it made Sapkowski's books' sales skyrocket. Seeing that, the writer demanded 6% recurring royalties from CDPR, but the final number that settled both parties is still unknown. The only thing that both sides have announced is the transfer of rights to the publication of new tabletop games, graphic novels and other Witcher merchandise. The sudden request of money by Mr. Sapkowski can be explained by an urgent need to provide special medical care for his sick son, but this is just a theory. Rumor has it that it's Mr. Sapkowski's son whom we owe the Witcher universe, that inspired numerous screen adaptations, the most popular being the Netflix series. It got such high scores from critics that the series was instantly extended for several seasons. The Wild Hunt success lies on the shoulders of the brave lads from CDPR, Konrad Tomaszkiewicz, development lead, Boris Pugacz-Murashkiewicz, and Marcin Blacha, scriptwriters, Marcin Przybylowicz and Mikołaj Straczynski, composers, and many others who have been sharpening their skills in the previous Witches, only to present us this masterpiece. This is felt literally everywhere in the game, in the staging, in the amount of details in the open world, in the soundtrack. And for fuck's sake, even the game within the game looks brilliant. Yes, I'm talking about you, Gwent. While other major studios were busy selling DLCs as new AAA games, guys from CDPR were busy selling AAA games as DLCs. When they needed a new engine to bring all upcoming ideas to life, they didn't try to milk the old one dry. Instead, they just made a new one all by themselves. Yes, this reproach is addressed to you, Todd Howard. I won't be buying Skyrim from you again. When it became evident that it's time for The Witcher to leave the linear gameplay and semi-open world behind, CD Projekt made one of the best open worlds to date. One thing is when such a world is created by Rockstar, with their experience and an army of employees, and completely another when the same world is created by a bunch of enthusiasts from Poland who only have 2 games behind them. We all remember the release of The Elder Scrolls V, that was praised to the skies and deemed the best RPG of the decade. And then Wild Hunt checked in, to show how the best RPG of the decade truly looks like, with its marvelous plot, great quest system, excellent gameplay, astounding soundtrack, and startling graphics. That explains the rise of The Witcher. So, no matter how badly the guys from CDPR have messed up with the release of Cyberpunk, the credit of trust earned thanks to The Witcher series will certainly help them overcome the situation they found themselves in and give the world to the game it wants. Thank you so much for watching. What quest from the Witcher franchise was your favorite? Share with us in the comment section. Be sure to smash that like button, subscribe and click the bell. See you on Drigmatic.